You planning to fly this Iron Bird? Skip your morning stretches? Colonel Lorne burst into laughter when the gray-haired woman stepped into the cockpit. She remained silent, pulled on her gloves, checked the control panel. When the storm hit, the main pilot collapsed from pressure. No one else dared to fly, but the A-70 roared to life. The pilot? Still her. An officer whispered, "That's Carter's last student, the ghost pilot." Elena Park, 59 years old, stood at the edge of the Colorado mountain base, watching the morning fog lift from the tarmac. Once an Air Force technical officer and backup pilot, she had been living quietly in retirement near the Rocky, Colorado base for 3 years. The call had come unexpectedly. They needed her expertise for an internal training session with the A-70 tactical transport aircraft. The base was short on experienced technical personnel, and her name had surfaced in the old files. As she climbed aboard the massive aircraft alongside the young flight crew, no one recognized that her name had been buried in classified tactical files for an entire decade. She had deliberately kept a low profile, avoiding the spotlight that came with her past missions. She still wore her old flight suit, carefully making notes in her personal logbook, methodically checking the fuel systems. The crew watched her like she was a stranger, assuming she was just another old lady doing logistics support. Colonel Lorne, commanding the training flight, burst into loud laughter when he saw her standing near the cockpit entrance. His voice carried across the entire cabin, dripping with condescension. "You planning to fly this Iron Bird? Skip your morning stretches today?" The younger crew members snickered, exchanging glances that said everything. Here was another retiree who didn't know her place, trying to relive her glory days. Elena didn't react. She simply placed her hand on the control console, checked the pressure warning lights, then pulled back, remaining silent. Her weathered fingers moved with practiced precision, but to everyone watching, it looked like nervous fidgeting. In everyone's eyes, she was irrelevant, and nobody needed advice from someone who had moved on from active duty. They saw an old woman in an outdated flight suit, someone who probably flew cargo runs decades ago. What they didn't see were the calluses on her hands from thousands of hours gripping control sticks in impossible conditions. They didn't notice how her eyes automatically tracked every instrument reading, or how she instinctively positioned herself where she could reach the emergency controls. The disrespect was palpable. Whispered jokes about grandma pilot circulated among the crew. Someone even suggested she might be more comfortable in the passenger section. Elena absorbed every slight in silence, her expression never changing. She had learned long ago that words were cheap, and proving yourself was the only currency that mattered in the sky. As the engine spun up for takeoff, she took her assigned seat in the back, knowing that sometimes you have to let others fail before they'll let you succeed. The A-70 lifted off into harsh but manageable weather conditions, exactly what you'd expect for a routine training exercise. The morning briefing had indicated some turbulence, but nothing beyond the scope of standard mountain weather patterns. Lieutenant Ryan Foster, the main pilot, exuded confidence in the captain's seat. At 32, he had logged impressive flight hours, but most of his experience came from clear weather coastal runs. Mountain weather was a different beast entirely, unpredictable, violent, and unforgiving to those who underestimated it. As they climbed past 15,000 feet, the weather shifted without warning. A low-pressure system that wasn't supposed to arrive until evening had moved in faster than predicted, creating a spiral storm that the meteorologists had completely missed. The first sign of trouble came as a subtle vibration through the controls. Ryan felt it but dismissed it as normal turbulence. Then the warning lights began their urgent symphony, altitude alerts, pressure warnings, navigation errors cascading across the instrument panel. The automatic adjustment system failed after Ryan made 2 critical input errors, overriding the computer's calculations with manual adjustments that fought against the aircraft's natural stability. The A-70 began to shudder violently. Elena leaned forward from her back seat, her voice calm but urgent. "We need to check the mid-level radar again. The pressure differential is—" Ryan cut her off sharply, his voice tight with stress and wounded pride. "I don't need a ground supervisor telling me how to fly." Elena fell silent, settling back into her seat, her hands gripping her logbook so tightly her knuckles went white. She had seen this exact scenario play out before, in training simulations and real emergencies. Pride had killed more pilots than mechanical failure ever would. The pressure differential increased dramatically, causing the cockpit to pitch and roll unpredictably. The aircraft felt like it was being shaken by an invisible giant, systems failing faster than the crew could respond to them. Ryan's face went pale as the G-forces hit him. The sudden pressure change caused him to become lightheaded, and his head lolled forward toward the control panel. For a terrifying moment, no one was flying the plane. The navigation system went dark. Backup power kicked in, but half the instruments remained dead. The A-70 was flying blind in the heart of a mountain storm, with a crew that had never faced anything like this before. Colonel Lorne's voice cracked with panic. "Someone take control." Now, but there was no one to take control. The co-pilot was barely out of flight school, trained only on simulators. The other crew members were specialists in cargo and communications, not emergency piloting. They were all looking at each other with the same realization. They were in serious trouble. Elena stood up, her voice cutting through the chaos for the first time since takeoff. "Put me in the pilot's seat. If you don't, this aircraft will never see the base again." The cockpit fell silent except for the screaming of warning alarms. A young officer, his voice shrill with fear and disbelief, shouted back, "Who do you think you are?" Elena's response was steady, each word delivered with quiet authority. "I'm the only person on this aircraft who has ever landed in a Kandahar sandstorm with no cockpit and no ground control." The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Everyone in that cockpit was doing the same calculation, their chances with an untested old woman versus their chances with no pilot at all. Colonel Lorne, his face ashen, stepped aside from the pilot's seat. Elena slipped into the pilot's seat like she had never left it. Her hands found the controls with muscle memory that 3 years of retirement hadn't dulled. The first thing she did was reduce the main throttle by 15%, a counterintuitive move that confused everyone watching. "Why are you slowing down?" Colonel Lorne demanded, his voice tight with fear. Elena didn't answer immediately. She was listening to the aircraft, feeling its rhythm through the control stick. Her fingers danced across switches and dials with surgical precision, each movement deliberate and confident. She adjusted the auxiliary wings to regain flight axis, a technique most pilots never mastered because it required flying by feel rather than instruments. As she worked, she whispered the mantra her old instructor had drilled into her. "The aircraft doesn't save people. The person controlling it saves everyone on board." The radar began flickering back to life, section by section. Elena was flying partially blind, using light angles through the windscreen to judge position, determining wind direction from the vibrations in the control stick. It was old-school flying at its most dangerous and most beautiful. A young officer, his voice filled with awe and disbelief, asked, "How did you learn to fly without radar?" Another crew member whispered, the pieces finally clicking into place. "Wait, are you Elena Park, the student of the ghost pilot?" Elena remained focused on the controls, but her silence spoke volumes. The ghost pilot, Captain James Carter, was a legend in military aviation circles. He had trained only a handful of pilots in his advanced techniques before disappearing on a classified mission over hostile territory. His students were known for their ability to fly in impossible conditions. As the A-70 punched through the final cloud layer, sunlight cut through the cockpit like a blade. The aircraft stabilized, its movements becoming smooth and controlled once again. The 5 crew members looked at each other in stunned silence, processing what they had just witnessed. Elena had done more than save their lives. She had made it look effortless. Where Ryan had fought the storm, Elena had danced with it. Where the instruments had failed, she had trusted her instincts and decades of experience. The flight back to base took another hour, with Elena maintaining perfect control despite weather conditions that would have challenged even experienced mountain pilots. She navigated using landmarks that existed only in her memory and skills that couldn't be taught in any flight school. When they finally approached the base for landing, the weather had worsened to near-zero visibility. Other aircraft had been grounded, waiting for the storm to pass. But Elena brought the massive A-70 down with the precision of a surgeon. The touchdown so smooth that some crew members didn't realize they had landed until they felt the engines powering down. As the cockpit door opened and ground crew rushed to meet them, Elena stood up slowly, removed her gloves, and made her first and only announcement of the entire flight. Training exercise complete. She walked past the stunned faces of her crewmates, past the ground personnel who were already buzzing with questions about how they had managed to land in such conditions. Elena said nothing more. Her flying had done all the talking necessary. The young officer who had questioned her authority approached hesitantly. "Ma'am, we had no idea who you were." Elena paused at the aircraft door, looking back at the crew she had just saved. Her expression wasn't angry or vindictive. It was the calm satisfaction of someone who had proven a point without needing to gloat about it. "Now you do," she said simply, and walked down the stairs into the storm. Behind her, the crew stood in the cockpit, looking at the seat where she had performed what could only be described as a miracle of aviation. The instruments were still flickering, the weather was still dangerous, and they all knew with absolute certainty that without Elena Park, they would not have survived the day. The old woman they had dismissed as irrelevant had just reminded them why respect is earned, not given, and why experience trumps arrogance every single time. Word of the rescue spread through the base like wildfire. Within hours, everyone knew the story of the gray-haired woman who had saved 5 crew members in conditions that had grounded every other aircraft on the base. A photograph taken by base security cameras captured the moment perfectly. Elena at the controls, her eyes focused and calm amid a cockpit full of flashing warning lights and panicked faces. The image was shared thousands of times across military social networks and internal forums. On the base's internal military forum, a single comment appeared below the photograph that captured everything. "She didn't just control the aircraft, she controlled our faith in what's possible." The transformation was immediate and profound. Officers who had snickered at Elena's appearance now approached her with genuine respect. The maintenance crew wanted to hear her technical insights. Young pilots requested informal mentoring sessions. Colonel Lorne, humbled by the experience, submitted an official recommendation for Elena to be appointed as an honorary instructor in wartime flight techniques. His report detailed not just her technical skills, but her grace under pressure and her ability to perform when everyone else had given up. The base's technical department hung a wooden plaque outside the main briefing room, Elena Control Room, where the forgotten returned to lead. It became a symbol of the respect that had been overdue for far too long. The most meaningful gesture came from the young officer who had questioned her authority during the crisis. He appeared at Elena's door 3 days later, holding a tarnished flight badge. "I found this in storage," he said quietly, his earlier arrogance replaced by genuine humility. "It belonged to Lieutenant Colonel Carter. I think he would want you to have it." Elena accepted the badge without words, but those who knew her could see the emotion in her eyes. It represented not just recognition of her skills, but acknowledgement of the legacy she carried and the respect she had finally earned. The base established an informal tradition. Before every difficult training mission, crew members would walk past Elena's photograph in the hallway. It served as a reminder that expertise could come from unexpected places and that wisdom often wore the face of someone you might otherwise overlook. Elena returned to her quiet retirement, but now she was no longer forgotten. Young pilots sought her advice, commanders consulted her on weather conditions, and everyone understood that beneath the gray hair and modest demeanor was one of the finest aviators any of them would ever meet. The woman they had dismissed had become the standard by which they measured their own courage and skill. Nobody expected a gray-haired woman to save an entire crew in the middle of a mountain storm. But sometimes the only thing you need to keep everyone alive is someone who has failed before, who has been pushed aside, but who never forgot how to maintain their composure under pressure. Elena didn't need anyone to recognize her as a pilot. She only needed one flight to remind the world that she had never forgotten how to fly. And this time, the sky belonged to her. The real lesson wasn't about flying techniques or weather navigation. It was about the danger of judging people by their appearance, about the value of experience over confidence, and about the quiet strength that comes from proving yourself through action rather than words. Elena Park had spent 3 years in retirement, but she had never stopped being a pilot. And when the moment came, the sky remembered who she really was.